Dann möchte ich jetzt das Wort übergeben Anders Pape Möller.
Grüezi. Vielen Dank. If people don't understand English, I can also try to do it in Danish, in Swedish, or perhaps in Spanish.
Spanish, yes.
Spanish, that's good.
Bueno. Habla castellano. Entonces, so what I'm going to try to do today is to tell you a little bit about the research I've been doing during the last 25 years in Tschernobyl and the last 5 years in Fukushima. And the reason for doing this is that quite a large number of people are interested in this subject of what are the effects of radiation on animals and plants, and also ultimately on human beings, as we have seen in some of these heartbreaking films that have been shown here. And I don't imply the last film. There was not much heartbreak in that one. So the difficulty with radiation and radioactivity is that you can't see it, and what is also partially implied in this last film from these two Austrians is that on the surface everything looks fine and perhaps even idyllic and beautiful in many ways. And is this really how it looks like? And that's why I call this the creation of the Chernobyl myth, because there's a lot of mythology. It's not only a question of facts or reality. There's also this mythological part. As you all know, the accident at Chernobyl was on the 26th of April 1986, and huge amounts of radioactive material was spewed out from this damaged reactor, and it spread across large areas in Belarus and in Russia, and actually there's less in Ukraine than in these two neighboring countries. What you can see from this map is also that there's quite a lot of heterogeneity in the distribution of this radioactivity. So in this so-called exclusion zone around the reactor, there are areas that are completely clean, just as clean as this room here, and there are other areas that are extremely contaminated. So it's possible to work in neighboring sites that differ enormously in level of radioactivity. That was not something that was talked about or mentioned very much in this last film, but basically what we would like to know is how are living organisms doing in the clean areas, how are they doing in the contaminated areas, are there differences between these two, and can we attribute that difference to radioactivity? You can also see from this map here, and this is also well known to many people, that there was very contaminated areas in Finland, parts of Sweden and Norway, and even in parts of Austria and northern Italy. As the previous film showed, there are many strange kinds of animals living in these places, and not all of these are wolves, even though they might look like wolves. For example, this one here, I think it actually is a dog, but this is what we call Chernobyl wolf. When you go to the exclusion zone, one of the striking things is how little the nature has recovered since 1986. From the previous film, it sounded as if nature has taken over, and it's not quite the case. This is a picture from the Red Forest, the most contaminated area in the Ukrainian part of the exclusion zone. And you can see here logs of pine trees lying there on the ground. And the strange thing is that if pine trees die, usually this trunk will be completely decomposed and disappear after something like 10, 15, perhaps 18 years. But this area here, if you go there today, the log is just as hard as this table. And this suggests that the microorganisms, the invertebrates that usually decompose these kind of biological material. They are not doing their job. Perhaps there are not that many of them left. It's not only the exclusion zone that is contaminated, also areas in the surroundings, and that's where people live. There are many, many villages that are contaminated to different degrees, and if you visit these places, you can buy potatoes or strawberries, and they look on the surface very nice, but if you take out your dosimeter, unfortunately, it turns out that they are very often quite contaminated. And this is what local people are eating, because they can't eat anything else. They eat the local produce if they have to buy it, or they grow it themselves. Just a few words about Fukushima. You know this area in northern Japan on the coast where the nuclear power plant is located. And you can see this area that is contaminated, and in blue I show you the study areas where we have been following bird populations, but also populations of many other kinds of animals since 2011. And here is my colleague from Japan helping with our field work. The mythology about the Chernobyl area comes partly from a film, a documentary that was produced by the organization Arte, the French television the French television production unit. And this film about Chernobyl, I must say, unfortunately, I was part of it. But it was a rather strange kind of experience, because on the first day when I was asked to participate in this film, the director of the film, he brought a contract where I had to sign that I would not object to anything that was shown in this film. And I said, I can sign, but I can't promise to do this. And it turned out there was a good reason for this, because in the film there's some nice sequences of very big mammals like red deer and wolves also. Unfortunately, in this documentary, these sequences were not filmed on location in the exclusion zone. It turned out that they were filmed in Germany. And they were put into this film, this documentary, without mentioning the source of where the pictures came from. And this is what I mean by mythology. Another different example of this mythology is European satellite image company Atrium that's trying to sell their products, these satellite images, and what they have shown in their commercials is these packs of wolves that are supposedly living in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. And I can say for sure that this is simply impossible, because these wolves, they are living in this area here with rocks and cliffs, and there are no rocks and cliffs in this area. So I sent an email to this company and asked, what's going on? Why do you write about Chernobyl recovery when these wolves are not from Chernobyl? And they said, yes, but you know, we couldn't find any pictures of wolves from Chernobyl. And I said, this is not really a good excuse, because it gives the wrong impression. So this image of Chernobyl has been broadcast quite widely to many populations in Europe, and it's also been on television in Japan and elsewhere. But we can still ask the question, even though many journals and newspapers write that Chernobyl area has become a wildlife haven, is that really true? And I will try to convince you that this is not the case. Before going into detail showing you some of the negative effects of radioactivity on free living organisms in this area. I'll just tell you a little bit about how we measure the level of radioactivity in these different animals that are living in these areas. Is it possible to measure the radiation dose received by a bird or another small animal? And indeed it is. What we have done over the years is to use small dosimeters that we put together with a ring on the leg of a small bird, and they can easily carry this. It weighs just a fraction of a gram. And when we capture this swallow, this Auschwalbe in Deutsch, then we can retrieve this small dosimeter and we can measure how much radiation has accumulated in this small device over time. Another thing we can do is to, when we catch the bird, we put it in a small bag, and then we use a gamma radiation spectrometer that we have here. This is the same kind of equipment that's used in the airport, and you have to go through one of these doors with this kind of equipment telling the control people in the airport if you are smuggling uranium or plutonium or whatever. Here in our field vehicle, we have 500 kilograms of lead that is shielding this small bird against radiation from the surroundings. And then we have our spectrometer inside this small container. And what we can do there is we can measure the background radiation without the bird being present. That's the blue dots here in this graph. And we can put the bird in afterwards and measure the same thing again, and that's the red dots. And what you can see here is that there is an area where there's a small difference between the two curves, the blue and the red one. That's the difference between the signal caused by the bird and the background. And if we look at the difference between the two curves, we got this result here. You can see this blip, and that's the measure of cesium-137. So we can quantify quite clearly the amount of radioactive material inside such a living bird. We're not damaging them. After we have captured them and bring them, we throw them out again. And they go back to their nest where they are doing their things. So if we catch several hundreds of these birds of different species, we can measure what is the level of radioactivity inside the body of these birds, what's the level of radioactivity in the surroundings where we captured the bird, and we find nice positive relationships. So the higher the level of radiation in the environment, the higher the level of radiation inside the body of these birds. It's not surprising. We should expect such a positive relationship. But what you can see here is that the different lines with the different colors represent different species. So some species have much higher levels of radiation for a given level of background radiation than you would expect. And why is that the case? That's where the biology comes in. So, people always ask about mutations. And I don't know what people have in their heads when they talk about mutations, but we don't see any of these kinds of organisms in the field, and they were not in the Austrian film either. And the same applies to the tomatoes. Usually they don't look like this. But still, we can see mutations very easily. Of course, it's a question of willingness to open your eyes. One example is these firebugs. You are probably familiar with them. They are living mainly on linden trees, the trunks of linden trees. They eat the seeds under the tree. And you can see here, there is only one of these that looks normal. And it's this one. All the others are abnormal in terms of the size of these dots or the coloration and so on. And you can see here, if we go out and take samples of these insects in the field, in the Tschernobyl exclusion zone, we get these nice positive relationships between the frequency of abnormalities and levels of radiation. The higher the level of radiation, the higher the level of abnormalities. So that's a very nice, good example of a dose response. We have also done the same thing with the barn swallows, with the Rauschwalben, where we catch the adult birds and we take blood samples from them and also from their offspring. And here in the gels of the DNA samples, we have the father and the mother of these offspring with their bands, and then we have a number of chicks. You can see here that we have a band here that's not present in the father or the mother, therefore it must be a mutation. And there's a couple of other mutations over here. And basically what you can show is that the birds that are in these contaminated areas around Chernobyl, they have a higher mutation rate than Ukrainian control or Italian control birds. So it's possible to go out and demonstrate. Indeed, there is an increase in the level of mutation rates. I'll just show you a few slides from the field. And it's slightly less glamorous than the Austrian film. Here we have one of our helpers. We have many people that we pay to join us in the field and help collect the data. Unfortunately, many of the Ukrainians that do this for money, they are not very careful in terms of safety and security and appropriate behavior. You should not eat apples from very contaminated areas. It's really a bad thing, but some people just don't take advice. And this is, again, from the field. We're sitting there measuring swallows while our helpers are trying to collect the birds from the nets. And sometimes we meet some of the locals, small entrepreneurs who are constructing, in this case, a ladder so we can climb to the swallow nests. So I showed already these firebugs and the abnormalities, but there are many other abnormalities in other organisms, and I'll just show you a few so you can see how it looks like. Here we have the swallow again, and usually the coloration of this plumage is dark reddish-brown, but here we have these white spots. So this is a typical example of such an abnormally colored bird. Here we have another barn swallow with a small tumor on the beak. Here we have an individual that has a hole in the beak. They can't close the beak. Here we have another individual with three tumors on the sternum, the breastbone, and we can quantify that by catching hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of birds, and we have done this for the swallows in many different populations. And you can see here in the contaminated area around Chernobyl, 18% of the birds have these kinds of abnormalities, whereas control birds from uncontaminated areas in Ukraine, only 3.7% have these abnormalities. And that's the same as in control populations in Denmark, Italy, and Spain. So there are many more birds with abnormalities in contaminated areas in Ukraine. And surprise, surprise, if we go to Japan, to Fukushima, we see the same thing. We are so lucky that the swallows are also breeding in Japan, the same species, and we can follow them. And here we have a male barn swallow ringing the alarm bell at Fukushima. And if we take a camera with a good lens, we can get close-up pictures of the swallows. And you can see here, it also has these white spots as the barn swallows from Chernobyl. It's not only the swallows that look a little bit strange, it's also many other species. Here we have a chaffinch, buchfink, and you can see here the white spots in the plumage. They should commonly have a different color. Here we have a great tit, and a kohlmeise, and you can see on one side of the head it has two big tumors, and on the other side of the head it looks normal. It's the same bird from the two sides. Here we have a common whitethroat with a large tumor on its head. It's eine Grasmücke. I think that's the correct German word. And here we have another bird with a tumor on its wing, a huge lump of stuff. And here we have our bestiarium of birds from Tschernobyl with all different kinds of abnormalities and malformed individuals. And you can see that in total, out of these 1,000, almost 700 individuals, there were 111 cases of albinism, which is much, much higher than in anywhere else in Europe. And we had 25 individuals with clearly visible external tumors. And usually I've caught in my life perhaps 50 or 60 or 70,000 birds, and I have never seen any tumors on any bird. So tumors are very rare. Perhaps they are not so rare, but a bird with a tumor doesn't live very long. And the reason is that it's dangerous to be out there because there are predators everywhere, and the predators are hungry, and they eat the birds or the other animals that they can catch most easily. So it's not surprising that you don't see many tumors in wild animals, because these animals, they die. Another strange observation that we made some years ago was that we have been measuring the heads of these birds, and we did that because there were some studies from Belarus of medical doctors showing that the incidence of small heads in humans was increased. So there was these microcephaly children quite commonly in some regions of Belarus, just as we can see in the newspaper today as a consequence of this Zika virus. And we started measuring heads in the birds, and the argument is that birds living in contaminated areas were subject to very high levels of oxidative stress. That's to say, the radiation is causing damage to DNA and other molecules, and this affects the development of these animals. Of course, they can partly get rid of free radicals that are created by this oxidative stress by using antioxidants, but there are limits to how many antioxidants can be found in the environment, because this can only appear through ingestion of food. And what we could show for the birds in the contaminated areas in Chernobyl is that their brain size is on average 5% smaller than the brain size of individuals of the same species, but in control areas in Ukraine. Birds have a fixed brain size in the sense that the skull is made out of bone, so it doesn't change. You don't get, sorry?
The microphone.
Ah. So what we can show is that the birds, they don't change the size of the head. If you measure the size of the head of a bird in 1 year, and then the next year it maintains its head size. But if we compare the head volume of yearlings and older individuals of the same species, we find a significant difference. That's to say, the individuals that have larger heads survive better, and therefore they become older more often than the individuals with small heads. So it's not a good thing for these birds to have a small head or a small brain. It's not only the brain and neural tissue that's subject to oxidative stress, also the lens of the eyes, which is a protein structure, is affected by radiation. And here we have two rodents that we have captured. You can see this eye here has a white spot, which is a clear cataract, and this is the same individual photographed from the other side. And you can see there's no cataract there. Here we have two lenses of an animal with the clear cataracts. You can see there's a big spot. You can see the pattern of the millimeter paper through the lens, whereas in these two examples here, the lenses are quite clear and there's no cataract at all. And if you have higher levels of radiation, you have higher cataract scores in these rodents. So clearly, the rodents living in more contaminated areas have more eye problems, and they can't go to their eye doctor and have their lenses corrected. So what happens to these mice that have these cataracts? Well, they die. As I said before, we've been catching many birds and large numbers of birds over the years. And what we can show is that for many birds it's possible to determine if they are old or 1 year only. And with this information we can calculate what is the adult survival rate. Birds of 15 different species breeding in highly contaminated areas around Tschernobyl, they have an average adult survival rate of something like 30-35%, whereas birds from less contaminated control areas in Ukraine, they have a survival rate of around 50-55%. And that's exactly the same value as we find for the same species studied in England, in an area where there's no level of contamination. So indeed, we can show that there's a dramatic reduction in survivorship of these birds living in the contaminated areas around the exclusion zone. It's not only the survivorship, it's also their reproductive rates, and one measure of this is the frequency of abnormal sperm cells in birds. You can see here that in a sample of sperm cells, there are several that are damaged. You can see this one here has an odd-looking head, and there's another one here, and there's another one that's bent there. So usually in birds, around 2 to 5% of the sperm cells are abnormal in one way or another, whereas in the Chernobyl area we can show that up to 30-35% of all sperm cells are abnormal. They're damaged and unable to fertilize eggs. And of course this is a bad thing because without sperm cells you don't get any fertilized eggs, and therefore you don't get any babies. So this should have consequences for population size of these birds. And here I'm going to show to you two short videos from our fieldwork, this time in Fukushima, but we have similar videos from Tschernobyl. And what we do is that we go out to the field and study the abundance of different bird species. We go to a particular study site. We stay there for 5 minutes and record the number of birds that are present at that site. Then we walk 100 meters along this road and make a new count, and so on and so on. And in this way we have made thousands of counts of birds and other organisms, both in Fukushima and in Chernobyl. And this is how it sounds in one such site. Why is this not working? Ah, there he is. You can hear there was a bird singing. Oh, there's a garrulax. Ah, there was a meadow bunting. And there was a bulbul. So in this particular place here, there were 8 different bird species, and I'll just show you the other short video from another site, just 100 meters away. Same road, same day, just a few minutes later. Can you hear anything? Shh. The habitat, the forests look exactly the same. There are houses in both places. So in the topmost site, this one over here, there was hardly any contamination. And the contamination level in this area here was more than 1,000 times higher. So it's, you can hear immediately when you go to the field what is the level of contamination. You don't need your dosimeter. You have a biological dosimeter, so to speak. And that's why I call it this the Silent Spring, because it reminds of Rachel Carson's book from the early 60s after the first effects of pesticide use in farming. What we can expect with the reduction in abundance of birds in these contaminated areas is that we should have very few active nests, and the swallows build nests on houses, as I've shown to you already, if you don't know it yourself. And you can see here in the most contaminated villages in the Fukushima area, there is a very small proportion of the nests that are active. There's very few swallows left, whereas in the least contaminated villages, we have more than 50% of all nests active. So the birds go to the areas where there's less contamination. And as I showed or said to you before, when we go out and make counts or censuses of breeding birds, these 5-minute counts that I showed in the 2 small videos, you can see here that the higher the radiation level, the smaller is the abundance of birds. So on average, you only have very high levels of abundance of birds with more than 10 individuals in such a particular site at low levels of radiation, whereas at high levels of radiation, very often there's many fewer birds. It's not only how many birds there are, we can also show their effects on the vocalizations that they make. I don't know how it is here in Switzerland, but I know in Ukraine and also in Belarus and Russia, children, they go out and listen to the cuckoo when it comes in the spring, and you count the number of times the cuckoo says cuckoo, because that is reflecting the number of years you're going to live. And therefore it's quite important. I remember when I was a small boy, I did this many times, and I was cheating sometimes because it was only a few repeats, and I would like to live a long time, so I wanted it to be many repeats. But what you know the call of the cuckoo, and I can probably, with a little bit of luck, make this one say something. So it has these repeated cuckoo, 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 and the same individual will continue for a number of repeats. And what we have shown recently is that the number of repeats depends on the radiation level. In highly contaminated areas, there's very few repeats, usually less than 20, whereas in uncontaminated areas up to 130. So this is quite interesting, because we all know that the people who are living in these contaminated areas in Tschernobyl and also in Fukushima, they don't, at least for the people in Tschernobyl, they don't survive so well, and this is what the cuckoo is telling us. Just a couple of more results before I stop. First of all, we have also been working on plants for quite a while, because plants are easy to capture. They stay where we once found them, and you can follow them during many years. Here we have pine trees from Tschernobyl area, and you can see here the tree trunks with the annual growth increments. This is 1986. So this is the wood made before the accident, and this is made after the accident. You can also see with a little bit of good luck that the increments, the growth increments, are larger in this part than in this part. And what you can do is to drill out small tree cores from the trunks. And it's a nasty job, especially if you do it in winter when it's very cold. And then you can afterwards go out and you can measure the actual growth increments for these trees. Here I have done it a little bit complicated way, because a value of 0 means that this is the growth of a tree of that species and that age as you would expect. So positive values means that they're growing more, and negative values mean that they're growing less than you'd expect for a tree of that species and that size and that age. And you can see here up until 1986, the average growth increment were close to 0. After 1986, there were 3 very bad years, which is less than you would expect by chance. So the trees, these pine trees, they didn't like the situation after the 1986 accident. And you can see there were several other years that were very bad. There were some that were quite good, depending on weather, of course. But on average, the trees were doing much worse after 1986. And we have similar results from Fukushima. Another aspect that relates to the tree trunks in the red forest that I mentioned quite a bit earlier is that it looks as if there are many fewer microorganisms and many fewer invertebrates chewing and decomposing this biological material, the leaves in these forests. And here is my US colleague Tim Mousseau working hard in the field, putting down small plastic bags with the leaves from different species of trees. And we do this in September, and after 9 months we return. And then we have to retrieve these small bags with numbered tags. And you can see some of these have been well chewed by the earthworms and other creatures living in the soil, whereas other leaves like the pine needles are much more resistant to decomposition. And then we take our bags to the lab and dry them. And here we have Andreas Erhard somewhere. He's here in the audience also helping with this tedious work. We put out way too many of these bags, more than 500, and this has to be handled afterwards. And the nice result, the surprising thing is that the higher the radiation level is in these areas, the higher is the lower is the decomposition rate. So you can see here for the most contaminated study sites, the proportion that was decomposed or was missing after 9 months was only something like 50, 60, 70%, whereas in the uncontaminated areas, more than 90% of the plant material was decomposed. So there's a huge difference in the decomposition rate. So what can I conclude from this? Well, I think still, despite claims by Austrian films that Chernobyl is not a wildlife haven, there are some areas where there is very little contamination, and this is where the animals go, and this is where nature looks as it should. And there are other areas where there is much more contamination and where things go wrong. I will just, as a note, mention something bad that will make you awake all night. Lelyfeld published a paper a couple of years ago, and what he did was simply to make a list of all these major accidents that are classed as 4 up to 7. You know that there are only 2 accidents that are classified as 7. It's Fukushima and Tschernobyl. Here we have Mayak, and we have the other well-known sites. And he did this because it's quite interesting that there are so many accidents. So we know how many accidents there are, we know how serious they are, and we know where they are. We also know where are all the nuclear reactors in the world. So we can start making calculations. What would you expect? Where would we expect the next major accident? I'm not saying if we are having another major accident, because by definition I say it's inevitable that we'll soon have another major accident. And because we know the distribution of the strength of these accidents and where the nuclear reactors are, we can make a map of the risk of major contamination. And it's a depressing map. Because here you can see that in northeastern US, New York, Boston, and all these areas, they are living a dangerous life. In Europe, it's much, much worse. And you can see, even though you believe that everything is safe in Switzerland, it's not the case, I warn you. Radiation is coming to your neighborhood soon. Of course, we can be a little bit more optimistic and say, okay, let's look at Germany, because Mutti, Angela Merkel, she has promised us that she'll close down these reactors, but it doesn't change anything. The reason is that there are so many other reactors in the neighborhood that because of the large scale of spread of this radioactive material, we'll get plenty of risk from those sources alone. So, with this depressing message, sometimes you need a small glass, and here my US colleague and one Ukrainian colleague, they are having a small vodka just to recover. And finally, if any of you are interested in our scientific publications, our photographs or other resources, you can download them for free. I'm not asking for money or anything from this website. Thank you for your attention.